So once again, we come to St. Luke, and it's as if to say, if Luke were in the room, I would say, come on, Luke, we got the memo. You can't be wealthy and love God. So give us a break and start talking about sheep again. As David so rightly pointed out, the readings have been very condemnatory over the past few weeks. And the focus is on the conflict that we have around possessions. And it has to be said that it's as if the writers of the lectionary knew what Tim and I would be doing over the past few weeks and wanted to drive home the point of what it's like to try to downsize your possessions. Let me just say, Tim has been a huge help. Every time he does show up to lend a hand, I either find him reading a book in the living room, or if he finds something that he thinks we should do something about, he puts it on the dining room table. Our dining room looks like an Aladdin's cave at this point. So again, continuing to try to discern what it is to keep, what we value, what we prize, has been an experience that hopefully will end fairly soon. And part of it has been discovering things that, frankly, I'd forgotten that we had. That's the kind of amount of possessions that we have and the nature of possessions that is, I think, part of what Luke is getting at in the gospel. But anyway, plunging right ahead, I thought I'd show you what I found this week. So this week, I found a very prized possession, which is a signed photograph of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, and it's inscribed to Richard from Wallace and Edward. So Tim is baffled by my love of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. I see no problem at all with it. I think they were amazing, but probably a little bit problematic in this day and age. But anyway, more to come. And that's not going in the auction. With the release of the latest chapter called the final chapter of Downton Abbey, I thought I'd open with a few pertinent quotations from the Dowager Countess of Grantham, also known as Maggie Smith. She said famously in the series, when she is baffled and swung around by a swivel chair, she says, "What is this?" And Matthew, her soon-to-be grandson-in-law, says, "Oh, it's been around for a long time. It was invented by Thomas Jefferson." And the Countess says, "Why does every day have to involve a fight with an American?" Then there's the wonderful quotation, which is said at dinner, which when someone says they're coming for a weekend, Maggie Smith says, "What's a weekend?" And then finally, apropos of our gospel, she says, as dinner conversation turns, she says, "Oh, goody, now let's talk about money." So here we go. So it's about a story that Jesus tells in Luke, a parable about a dishonest manager. And this, as the commentators on this passage have pointed out, is probably the most controversial passage in the Christian Testament. It's produced endless reams of writing and explanation and examination over 2 millennia. And the heart of the matter is, the issue is, Jesus seems to be praising a very unsavory person, someone who is without any moral compass, someone who will do anything so that he continues to be entertained in the best homes. So we, because of our relationship to the Bible, in that we think it is meant to be only a moral guide or map, are confused by the fact that the main character in the parable is a dreadful person. Now, I can guarantee you, 2,000 years ago, that still would have caused people to pay attention. Because in a story where everybody is good and everything goes well, you kind of go asleep a little bit. But if you're told that someone who's not a very good person can do something and accomplish something, and the gospel continues, then you can do something as a good person even better, it gets your attention. So you have this dishonest manager, this person who is shrewd. Now, the commentaries have pointed out that what Jesus is praising is not the dishonesty of the manager, but the manager's shrewdness. And that's okay. That seems to be in accordance with the text. But I'd like to take it a little further and say it's shrewdness, but it's also acting on intentionality. It's figuring out what needs to be done. It's thinking and planning and acting, which does seem a very, very gospel thing to be doing. It's in the hands of, again, a dishonest person, but the dishonest person is capable of solving a problem, of acting, and then being praised for having done that action. So where is that in relationship to our own things, possessions, and wealth? Well, you know, Jesus again and again seems to be most critical of us when we fall asleep at the switch, when we go unconscious, when we stop examining our motives, our life, our relationships. Jesus again and again tells us in the Gospels, wake up, be aware. And because of his circumstances, the manager is hyper aware of what to do in this circumstance. So it's of a piece with that gospel message of be aware of your motives, what you're doing, and your actions. And so part of the problem with possessions that I've been struggling with is that Tim and I have so much that we aren't aware of what we have anymore. And now this week, and please pray for me this week, because this week is books and clothing. And it's going to be a lot. We both have more books than we could ever possibly read. And yet, like many of you, books have a deeply emotional connection, not to mention our intentionality of sometime in the distant future of having endless hours to read them. And that connection is difficult, because if we're not aware of what the reality is, which is exactly how much we have, and how little we're aware of what we have, that is a red flag. And it's not just a red flag because we are therefore asleep to our possessions, but as Luke would suggest in the gospel, it's also dangerous because we are then asleep to other things as well in our lives. If we are unaware and we aren't intentional, don't have some sort of plan, and take some sort of actions, we can go down the slippery slope, and actually our possessions can control us. And boy, is that true for me this last few months. And yes, people keep saying, won't it be a wonderful feeling when you have everything dealt with? And I'm like, you should be around at 6 o'clock every day when I leave the house, having lifted and carried and sorted over and over again. And I think it's not just about possessions, it's also, as the Countess of Grantham would remind us, it's about wealth. And it's about money and our relationship to it. And what Luke, I think, is saying in this gospel is look around, and people who have no faith basis, no relationship with God that's apparent, can make some pretty shrewd decisions. And how much better for you as a child of light to make decisions that are also shrewd. But not just for our own self-promotion or wealth, but what we can do with the resources. And that's, I think, at the center of the gospel. We need to be aware always of what the great needs around us, that the gospel, and more particularly our baptismal promises, have commanded us to be aware of. People in need, people who are frightened, people who are vulnerable, people for whom life has become unmanageable, for people who struggle on a daily basis in a way that we cannot really even conceive of. We need to be aware of what's happening in the world around us, and as a people of faith, to make a response. You know, another theme that's often talked about in terms of wealth in the Christian Testament is the idea of inheritance and legacy and what's to come after. And that's an important part of what it means to convey wealth in our own personal lives. But it also has a spiritual connection and meaning in the way that we are forming a legacy or aware of what we're handing on to the next generation. And it's not a bad thing to ask ourselves, in terms of being intentional, from time to time, to say, what do we, as a community of faith here at St. Peter's, want the next generation to remember about us? When they look back at the congregation of St. Peter's in 2025, what do we want them to know about us? Well, there are certain things that are apparent, and they're wonderful. First of all, we're in a beautiful place, in a beautiful church that's well maintained and very much part of our life of faith and our community. And we're a community that cares for each other, that watches out for each other, is aware of each other, and loves to be with each other. But we're also a congregation, I like to think, that part of our legacy will be that we did something in the community to help other people. That we looked beyond ourselves and said, what is the need of the world around us? Where do we have to be advocates, supporters, helpers for people in need? And that, I think, is a legacy I would love for St. Peter's to have, to build on and to continue. You know, as I've said before, St. Peter's is in a very rare position in the Diocese of New York. We're not worried about keeping the lights on, although it was a little chilly when you came in. We did pay the heating bill. We're not worried about keeping the heat on and the light on in this place. We have resources, and we have a very generous congregation that supports us. But we do need to be aware of how much more we can do, of how we can make lives of people better through a sharing of our resources, our wealth. And we'll be thinking about that especially in the next week or two when we come to promises. And we think about our outreach programs and not only how they can be sustained and maintained, but made bigger, expanded, and meeting more need. And that's why this event that's coming up and the work of the Outreach Committee is so central to our identity and our legacy as a generation here at St. Peter's. We are not struggling with survival, and that's a wonderful gift. And it's a gift to be aware of and to act on, which is in the resources we have, we can change people's lives. So, you may be stumped by this dishonest manager, but think instead of Jesus' words speaking to us as an invitation as well as a challenge. To take stock of what we have and who we are, and to take action then to make the world better, following Jesus' command, following our baptismal covenant, and following all that God would have us do in God's name. Amen.